the empty town. Amanda's car hummed steadily as she navigated through the winding back roads, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The GPS on her phone had led her off the highway, urging her to take a detour through a small town named Hollow Creek. The name sounded strange, and the lack of any recognizable landmarks made her uneasy. She glanced at her phone again, but the signal was weak, and the map barely displayed the town's location. At first, the drive was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no other cars on the road, not a single passerby, and the occasional rustling of the trees seemed like an unnatural sound against the silence. As she reached the outskirts of the town, the scenery began to change. The trees, which had been thick and heavy on the side of the road, began to thin out. Up ahead, Amanda could make out a rusted sign, barely visible behind the creeping vines and overgrown grass. "Welcome to Hollow Creek." The sign was cracked, the paint faded to a pale yellow. As she passed it, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something about the stillness, the absence of life. Even the air felt thicker, as though it was holding its breath. She slowed the car as she entered the town. The streets were eerily deserted. No cars, no people, not even the faint sound of dogs barking or birds chirping. The houses, though old and weathered, were pristine. The windows were clean, and the lawns were meticulously trimmed, but there was no sign of life. It was as though the entire town had been frozen in time. Amanda's eyes darted to a gas station on her right. The pumps were unused, the gas station's neon sign flickering weakly as if struggling to stay on. The windows of the attached convenience store were spotless, but the shelves were strangely bare, only a few dusty cans and forgotten packets of gum. She frowned but decided to keep moving. Further down the road, she came across a diner, a small, unassuming place called Kathy's Corner. The sign above it hung crookedly, but the interior lights were on, casting a warm, inviting glow onto the street. The emptiness of the town, however, began to gnaw at her. The atmosphere felt thick and unnerving. She pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine. The hum of the car's motor faded instantly, leaving behind a deeper silence that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of isolation bearing down on her shoulders, but the promise of a break from the endless drive urged her forward. The door to Kathy's Corner creaked loudly as she pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of coffee and something else she couldn't quite place, something faintly metallic. The diner's interior looked as if it hadn't changed in decades. The checkered floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and old vinyl booths lined the walls, each one empty except for a single cup of coffee left on a table, half filled and cooling. A plate of food sat untouched, pancakes, syrup slowly congealing, butter still in its unmelted form. "Hello!" Amanda called out, her voice reverberating too loudly for a place this still. The sound felt wrong. It felt like it wasn't supposed to exist here. She stepped inside further, glancing around, but there was no response. She checked the clock on the wall. It was 3:15. "That's strange," she thought, as the hands were frozen at that time. A chill crawled up her spine. She walked to the counter and noticed a single newspaper lying there, dated for that very day. But the date seemed strange. It was as if it was from the past. The front page was faded, as if it had been left out in the sun for years. A rustling sound came from the back, startling her. She turned sharply, half expecting someone to appear, but there was only the hum of an old refrigerator and the creaking of the walls. The seconds dragged on, but no one emerged. Frustrated and unnerved, Amanda stepped back outside, ready to leave. But as she did, she noticed something new, something unsettling. The entire street was darker now, despite the sun not yet having fully set. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, wavering shadows on the cracked pavement. It was as if the light wasn't coming from the bulbs themselves, but from some distant, unseen source. She quickly returned to her car, but when she turned the key to start the engine, the car sputtered, then died. The silence around her deepened, almost suffocating. Panic began to rise in her chest, and she immediately tried the key again. The engine turned, but the lights blinked once and then died. leaving her in near total darkness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Grateful for something, she pulled it out, but there was no signal. The map on her GPS was gone. She stared at the blank screen for a moment, disbelief settling over her. Suddenly, a soft noise broke the stillness behind her, a faint shuffling of footsteps. She spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty. A gust of wind swirled through the street, brushing against her skin, and she shivered. The footsteps began again, closer, louder. They were uneven, dragging along the pavement, like the sound of something, or someone, who could barely move. "Is someone there?" Amanda called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The street was silent once more. She tried to back away, but the shadows around her seemed to grow longer, creeping toward her with each passing second. The light flickered again, just a glimmer in the distance. For a moment, she thought she saw figures standing at the edge of the street. They were tall, their outlines jagged and unnatural against the dim light, and they swayed with the wind, their movements jerky and robotic. Amanda's heart raced as she turned to run. The footsteps were faster now, pounding behind her like a sickly rhythm. She didn't dare look back. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she sprinted toward the diner, but as she reached it, the door slammed shut in front of her. No one was there. The windows stared back at her, black and empty. When she turned to look at the street again, it had changed. The road stretched endlessly, curving impossibly in both directions. The figures in the distance were gone, but their presence lingered. The streetlights flickered, casting their erratic glow on the cracked pavement. Her breath came in short bursts, and she suddenly felt the overwhelming pressure of being watched. The whispering began then. It was faint at first, like the wind, but it grew louder with every passing second. Unintelligible murmurs filled the air, reverberating through her skull. The voices felt ancient, alive and dead all at once. They whispered her name. Amanda. She froze. She could feel them, the unseen figures surrounding her, their cold eyes fixed on her from every corner. They didn't speak in words, only in that unnerving whisper that crawled into her mind. Their forms began to materialize, pale, elongated figures that hovered just out of sight, their faces obscured by shadows. Each step she took seemed to draw them closer, their presence suffocating. "No, no, no," she whispered, backing away into the darkness, only to stumble into something solid. She turned to face the figure that blocked her path. It was herself. Her reflection was twisted, her eyes dull, her skin grey and lifeless. The figure's lips didn't move, but the voice came clear and cold from her own mouth. "You shouldn't have come." Amanda screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure raised its hand, and before she could react, the darkness consumed her entirely. The next morning, a car drove through Hollow Creek. The town was empty, as it always had been. The clock tower still stood, its hands frozen at 3:15. The echoes of whispers could still be heard in the air, lingering like a curse. At the desert lights. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly under the pale light of a waxing moon. It was a place of raw beauty, but also a harsh, unforgiving expanse of sand and rock. By day, it was searing and unrelenting. By night, it transformed into an alien landscape, eerily still, with shadows that played tricks on the mind. Jason and Mia stood beside their dust-coated SUV at the edge of nowhere. The car's headlights illuminated a patch of sand, beyond which the darkness seemed to swallow everything. Their destination was an unmarked location deep within the desert, where no maps would lead, but whispered tales and cryptic online forums had pointed the way. "This is it," Jason said, his voice full of barely contained excitement. He adjusted the strap of his camera bag, the lens of his prized possession reflecting the faint moonlight. Mia crossed her arms against the cold desert breeze, her eyes scanning the vast emptiness. She was uneasy, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The desert was supposed to be silent, but this silence was oppressive, as though the air itself was waiting for something to happen. "I don't like this, Jason," she said, her voice tight. "The stories, they weren't just silly ghost tales. People disappear out here. Some don't come back. Jason scoffed lightly, but didn't meet her eyes. People disappear because they're unprepared. We're not like them, Mia. We have supplies, GPS, and... He tapped his camera, grinning. We're documenting everything. This is going to be incredible. Mia shook her head, but she didn't argue further. They had been together for years, and she knew how Jason's mind worked. He was the kind of person who chased the extraordinary, even if it meant flirting with danger. They trekked deeper into the desert, their flashlight beams carving small circles in the vast darkness. The ground was uneven, shifting underfoot, and the temperature had plummeted sharply, the cold biting through their layers of clothing. An hour passed, then another. Just as Mia was about to insist they turn back, Jason stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Look," he whispered. At first, Mia didn't see anything. Then, in the distance, a faint glow appeared, pulsing, irregular, like the heartbeat of a living thing. "That's it," Jason breathed, his eyes wide. "The desert lights." The glow grew brighter as they moved closer, revealing not one but several orbs of light. They floated just above the ground, shifting in color, deep amber, electric blue, and a sickly green that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Jason was already filming, his excitement palpable. "Do you see this? This is incredible. These can't be natural." Mia, however, felt a knot tightening in her stomach. The lights weren't just glowing, they seemed alive. They moved in patterns, almost as though they were watching. "Jason, stop!" she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what these are." "They're beautiful," Jason said, his voice almost reverent. "We're witnessing something no one else has seen." But Mia felt it. A presence. The air seemed heavier now, the kind of weight that presses down on your chest and steals your breath. And then she heard it, a low hum, almost too low to register, vibrating in her bones. The lights began to move. One of the orbs floated closer, its glow intensifying until it cast harsh shadows across Jason and Mia's faces. Jason held out his hand, transfixed. "Jason, no!" Mia screamed, but it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed the surface of the orb, there was a flash of light so bright it seared her vision. Jason's scream pierced the silence, a sound of pure agony. His body convulsed, his arms flailing as though trying to fight off an invisible force. Mia stumbled back, shielding her face. When the light subsided, Jason was lying motionless on the ground. His eyes were wide open, glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the orbs. "Jason," Mia whispered, crawling toward him. His head turned slowly to face her, but his movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. His lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "You shouldn't have come." Mia scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights began to multiply, surrounding her, their whispers growing louder. "You will join us," the voices said, a chorus of tones that weren't human. Mia ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she sprinted across the sand. The orbs followed, their glow bathing the dunes in unnatural colors. She tripped and fell, the sand scraping her palms. When she looked up, Jason was standing before her, though she knew it wasn't really him. His eyes glowed brighter now, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "There's no escape," he said, his voice echoing as if the desert itself were speaking. The lights closed in, their whispers becoming deafening. Mia's screams were lost in the cacophony as the orbs engulfed her, their glow consuming everything. The next morning, the desert was as it had always been, quiet, vast, and indifferent. Jason's and Mia's SUV sat abandoned, half buried in sand. Their footsteps led into the dunes, but they stopped abruptly, vanishing without a trace. Locals who passed through the area claimed they saw new lights among the others, 2 orbs glowing faintly, pulsing in unison. The desert lights had claimed them, and their whispers would haunt the Mojave forever. The vanishing of Kaylee. It began as most unsettling stories do, in the mundane, unassuming quiet of everyday life. I was in my 20s, navigating the messy aftermath of a failed relationship, and had moved back to a small town outside Manchester, New Hampshire, to reset my life. Sundays became a ritual, church with my grandmother. It wasn't so much about faith for me, but about companionship and routine. The church, with its warm wooden pews and familiar hymns, felt steady in a way my life wasn't. That Sunday morning seemed no different from the others, until I noticed her. Kaylee. She stood near the back, hands clasped in front of her, her dark curls catching the light that filtered through the stained glass windows. Her hazel eyes were striking, almost golden, and when they met mine, I felt a jolt of something. Recognition, perhaps, though I didn't know her. She seemed out of place in the sea of familiar faces, and yet it was as though she belonged there more than any of us. After the service, I found myself approaching her without fully understanding why. Up close, she was even more captivating. There was a quiet intensity about her, like she carried the weight of things she could never share. We exchanged polite introductions, and she told me her family had just moved to the area. Her voice was soft, but deliberate, her words laced with an edge of mystery. Before I knew it, I had her number, my heart racing as if I'd won a prize I didn't deserve. Over the next week, Kaylee and I talked incessantly. Texts, late-night phone calls, and even a few pictures exchanged. She seemed to open up to me in a way that felt almost too fast, like she was desperate to let someone in. Her past, she revealed, was fractured. An abusive stepfather, a neglectful mother, and a childhood spent running from one toxic situation to the next. Despite it all, she seemed resilient, though there was a sadness in her words I couldn't ignore. By the end of the week, I worked up the courage to ask her out. She said yes without hesitation, her voice warm and light. We planned something simple, a movie, dinner, and a drive through the quiet back roads of New Hampshire. The date started out perfect. Kaylee was as charming in person as she was over the phone. She had a way of making you feel like the center of the universe when she spoke to you, her hazel eyes locked onto yours with unwavering focus. Dinner was filled with laughter, the kind that made me forget how lonely I'd been. Afterward, we decided to take that drive, the night stretching before us like an open book. The road we chose was one I'd driven countless times, a winding highway bordered by thick forests. The stars were bright overhead, and the silence was comforting. We talked about everything and nothing, her laughter blending with the hum of the car engine. And then it happened. Kaylee went quiet mid-sentence. At first I thought she was tired, but then I noticed her expression. Her eyes were unfocused, her body rigid. "Kaylee," I asked, glancing at her. She didn't respond. Instead, she started murmuring, low, guttural sounds that didn't sound like her at all. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. Her voice grew louder, the words faster, as if something inside her was unraveling. My heart pounded as I pulled over to the side of the road. She started shaking, her body convulsing as if caught in a violent seizure. Her head snapped back, and her eyes rolled into the back of her head, leaving only the whites visible. I was frozen with fear. "Kaylee!" I shouted, reaching for her, but she was unresponsive. The chanting grew louder, filling the car with a sound that felt too big, too ancient for the space. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Her head lolled forward, her breathing ragged. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wild, filled with something primal and unrecognizable. Before I could say a word, she threw open the car door and bolted into the woods. "Kaylee, wait!" I yelled, but she didn't stop. I stumbled out of the car, the flashlight on my phone barely piercing the darkness. The forest was unnaturally silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your chest feel heavy. I called her name again and again, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. I debated going after her, but fear rooted me in place. Something about the way she had moved, the way she had spoken, felt wrong, not human. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They combed the woods for hours but found nothing, not even a footprint. They asked about her family, but when I checked her number and social media, everything was gone. Her Instagram had been deleted. Her phone number was disconnected. The officers exchanged uneasy glances when I couldn't provide more information. I felt like a lunatic trying to convince them she was real. The next Sunday, I returned to the church, desperate for answers. No one there remembered Kaylee. Not the pastor, not the regulars, not even my grandmother. They insisted I must have been mistaken. There was no new girl at the service last week. It was as if she had never existed. In the months that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of her. At night, I would wake up drenched in sweat, her voice echoing in my ears, those strange, guttural words that no human should be able to speak. I left New Hampshire the following spring, hoping that distance would dull the edges of the fear. But it didn't. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can hear her laughter. And once, just once, I thought I saw her, standing at the edge of the woods near my new home, her hazel eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. They say some people come into your life for a reason. I can't help but wonder if Kaylee came into mine to show me something dark, something ancient, something I was never meant to understand.